Good morning. Today we're going to finish our series, The Sermon on the Mount. I hope you've enjoyed the study that we have provided through the Sermon on the Mount. We've looked at a number of different aspects of this particular message that Jesus had preached to those who had gathered there on the hillside. Today we are looking at his closing remarks. He's wrapping it up. And so that's exactly what we're going to do, and trying to look at the importance of what he was actually saying. I'm going to invite you, if you would, to grab your Bible or open your Bible and turn with us to Matthew chapter 7. We'll be reading from verse 24 through 29 in the New King James Version. And so I invite you to read along with me this morning. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on the house, and it did not fall, for it was founded upon the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell. And great was its fall. And so it was, when Jesus had ended these sayings, that the people were astonished. They were astonished at his teaching, for he had taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. As I mentioned, we see here in these few verses Jesus' closing argument. He's wrapping up all that he had shared with the people who had gathered on the hillside. And in this closing comment, he gives us an illustration that connects with each and every one of us. And he said to the folks, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, and this is the critical part, everybody had heard, but he added, and does them, will be like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. And when the storms of life came, it stood firm. And then we see it inverted. We see it flipped. And Jesus said, if you've heard these sayings of mine and you choose not to do them, you'll be like a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. And when the storms of life came, everything came crashing down around the owner. If you've ever seen a situation such as this, where an individual had built his dream only to have it come crashing down around his feet, you would totally understand Jesus' closing remarks. I want to look at his remarks today, and I want to make 3 comments / questions that can probe a little deeper and help us to see what he's saying. The first question that I ask, whose advice are you taking? Second, are you doing what you've heard? 3, the third comment is this: life doesn't always pay on Fridays. Let me begin with the first comment, the first question. Whose advice are you taking? In Matthew 7, those who were gathered there on the hillside had an opportunity of listening to his advice and now implementing it into their lives. over the last several months, we have had the opportunity of listening to a variety of speakers who have shared their insight into Jesus' message. And I'm sure something that was said along the way pricked your heart. Something spoke to you. Something challenged you. Are you listening to that advice? Are you listening to what you've heard? Because each and every one of us find that we are taking someone's advice. And when I think of that comment, whose advice? It reminds me of a story, an experience that I had while I lived in Africa. Some of you may remember Josh and Stephanie, the Sims family. They moved to Plano, Texas to serve on staff at St. Church. St. Church has been very involved in my ministry over the years, especially when we were in Africa. And while we were there, they sent different teams to come and work alongside of us in the work that we were doing in Africa. And so with one of those teams, when our work was done, we decided to take an African fun day. We took them to a game park, a game reserve, where there are a variety of wild animals, a variety of wild African animals in their natural habitat. And one particular moment, we're in the back of this Land Rover, this Jeep, and we see off in a distance a herd of elephant. They happen to be at a watering hole. And so we drove down, got close to the elephants, and we're sitting there, and you could hear the cameras back in the day when you could hear the click, click, click. People were taking their pictures. People had their video cameras out. One gentleman had climbed out onto the hood of the Jeep, and he was there to get a little bit closer, a little bit better view. And we were all there just taking in the moment. And I remember the ranger turning around and looking back, and he spoke to us. And he said, "Would you like to get out?" I'd been at that game reserve before, and I'd been with potentially even that particular ranger, and I'd gotten out on different occasions with other animals. And so here was another opportunity. I'd been out with Cape buffalo. I'd been out with the black rhino, the white rhino, as I said, a variety of different animals. And it was quite exhilarating, actually, to be able to stand there and be with them and to get your pictures with them. But I'd never been out with elephants. So I thought we were far enough away, probably about 80 yards away from them. And so I climbed up over the side of the Jeep. Tried to do it as quietly as I could. But when my feet touched the ground, one of the young bull elephants went wild. He came charging at the Jeep right at the nose where one of the gentlemen was out on the hood, and he was flapping his ears. He was trumpeting. He was mad. He was angry. I stood as still as I possibly could because I realized if I moved, I could not only endanger myself, but I can endanger those individuals who were there in the Jeep. I had chosen to listen to his advice and to act upon it. I look back now and I question the wisdom of his advice. Probably wasn't very smart getting out of the Jeep with the elephant. I know that now. But I must admit that at the moment, in the moment, it was quite the experience. It was quite the high. And I can remember that day as if it were yesterday. But I started a moment ago by asking one of three questions, making one of three comments. And the first was, whose advice are you taking? Because there are times that you're going to take the advice of a good friend, a good family member, etc., and that advice is going to lead you in the wrong direction, just as the ranger did for myself. A second question that I ask you today: are you doing what you heard? Well, as you heard just a moment ago, I was doing just as I had heard. The guy said, "Would you like to get out?" Hadn't hardly been out of his mouth a moment, and I was up and over the side of the Jeep. I wanted to get out. I wanted that adrenaline rush. I wanted that excitement. And the problem is that we are taking people's advice, and we are implementing that advice into our lives. But not all of the advice that we are receiving from our family or our friends is good advice. When we review the thoughts that were shared to us from the Gospel of Matthew that spoke to us about the Sermon on the Mount, we see Jesus giving us comment after comment, statement after statement that spoke to the heart of each and every one of us. Just recently, I was on the internet, and one of the highlights was a picture gallery which had a picture of 53 celebrities, individuals who were in the limelight, who had made the decision, "I will have no alcohol in my life." I decided to look through those pictures. And in the comments that were below, most of those individuals referenced or spoke to the fact that they had once consumed alcohol and it had become addicted to it, and it was eating away at their lives. And they knew that if there was any semblance of peace in their life, they had to walk away from it, and they had to do it now. And so some, it was a couple of years, some, a couple of decades, etc. But for these individuals, we see that the storm of life had come. They had received their wake-up call. And I love the fact that our God is the God of second chances. Even though He has given us instruction, He has given us advice, and if we don't take it, oftentimes we have another opportunity coming around where we can realize, I should have taken it, and then decide to do just as we have decided. And so I look at this and I ask you, what spoke to you over the last several months? And as I ask you this question and want you to reflect upon it, I want you to realize, though, that the messages that have been preached, the messages that have been spoken over the last several months, this is not a buffet. It's not a salad bar where we can decide, well, I don't want jalapeno peppers. I'd rather have banana peppers. I'd rather not have Thousand Island dressing. I'd rather have Italian. We can't come into this Sermon on the Mount with the idea that I'm going to pick and I'm going to choose what it is that I'm going to receive and implement into my life. And as we do so, we've got to understand what Jesus said. For those who hear these sayings of mine and do them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house, his life upon a rock. And when the storms of life came, his house stood. His life didn't crumble around himself. But for the foolish man who chose to hear the sayings of Jesus and not do them, he was compared to a person who built his house upon the sand. When the storms of life came, great was the fall of his house. I want to close with looking at a third comment. And it's important that we understand this, because life doesn't always pay on Fridays. Life doesn't always pay on Fridays. So when we get a bit of bad advice, You may feel exhilarated. You may have a high. You may be feeling like you're on top of the world. Everything's great. And you may actually reap some great benefits. Those who are around you may wonder, what's happened to so-and-so? Something's got to be going right in his life or her life. And from all superficial appearances, many realize or many believe that things are going well. In this situation, we find that when everybody's doing it, it sure makes a lot easier for us if we do it, because then we fit in with the crowd. But the consequences of a bad decision may be a long time in the coming. Because if we were to look at both homes, if we could have seen this illustration before us, both homes would have been magnificent. Both homes would have been amazing. Both homes would have been a lovely place to have lived. And so we look at this and we realize that both looked beautiful, but one was a lot cheaper to build. One was a lot easier to build. But the difference didn't show through until the storms of life came. And that's why I believe Jesus made a comment during the Sermon on the Mount, talking to us about the straight and narrow. That's why it feels like it's the straight and narrow way. He's telling us, here's what I want you to listen to. Here's what I want you to do. It's going to be hard, but it's going to be worth it. If you choose to take an easier path, it may appear as if you're doing better than the person who's on the straight and narrow. But the day will come for each and every one of us when the storms of life will come. When the winds are blowing, when the torrential rains are falling, when the floodwaters rising, and everything we've built our life on is tested to the very limits. I want to know that I've dug deep, that I've connected to the rock. Because when the storms of life come, I want my house to stand firm. And so, as we wrap up today, we wrap up with Jesus' closing arguments. Are you a wise man? Are you a foolish man? In all of the years that I've been preaching, in all of the years that I've been speaking, I've never chosen to use such a brazen ending to my personal message, where I would stand there and tell an individual, if you don't take my message, you're a fool. But we look at this and we see that Jesus said, you're foolish if you have heard my message and you turn and walk away from the advice I've given you. And as I said in the third comment, life doesn't always pay on Fridays, but there will be a payday coming where we'll reap all that we've sown, where we'll see everything that we've built our life upon. Will it stand? Or will it crumble down around our feet? Let me admonish you today. Be wise. Don't be foolish. Be wise. Don't be foolish. Listen to the words of Jesus. Listen to his instruction. And then live it out. Follow the straight and narrow. Because this way leads to life. God bless.